USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to Weekend Review Midweek Edition for Wednesday, March 17th, 2021. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. And the reason we're doing a midweek edition of Weekend Review is some of the weekend seeped into Monday and Tuesday as the Big Ten and the NCHC had their semifinal and final rounds, moved them up so that they could leave a little space before the NCAA tournament. And it was a couple of terrific semis and finals in both leagues. Let's start out with the Big Ten. On Monday, we saw Wisconsin need overtime to get past Penn State 4-3, a terrific game. And then Minnesota, the same thing. The Golden Gophers, a 3-2 overtime win over Michigan. And that was an epic battle as well. Well, why don't we talk about the Big Ten? We'll move on and look at their finals before we get to the NCHC. But two terrific games on Monday. Overtime in both games, late night TV watching, but just great hockey.
Yeah, it really was. You know, and there you were, Wisconsin in a situation against Penn State. You said needed overtime. And who's going to be your overtime hero? It's Cole Caulfield. And if this kid's not making such a great case for why he should win the Hobey Baker Award. His team falls short in the finals, but I don't care. He was a stud the entire tournament, as he has been really for the last 2 months. And, that was the excitement. It seemed that I thought that couldn't be really topped, but then you get Minnesota and Michigan, and the Wolverines jump out to a 2-0 lead, and Minnesota just chips away in the third period, finds a way to get the game to overtime and then win it. And, that I thought that those two games were extremely thrilling, and you usually can't find a championship game to match that. But once Minnesota and Wisconsin got out there, you knew you had some heavyweights, and a game that kind of got off the rails for Wisconsin in the second period. Minnesota's offense just explodes. They take a 5-1 lead, and at that point, because you had two games, I was really favoring the NCHC game to watch, and I missed a little bit of the comeback. And next thing you know, it's a 5-4 game. Again, Cole Caulfield getting the Badgers within a goal late in regulation, but Minnesota held on. Bobby Motzko gets the trophy for his club, a huge accomplishment. That it's been a while. I think it was 2014 was the last time Minnesota won the Big Ten championship. So that's one for Bobby Motzko to put a feather in his cap. That should, relieve a lot of pressure. If he's had, that typical pressure that goes along with coaching at the U, you got to win titles, or it's what did you do for us lately? This should take a little bit off. And I think that, Gopher fans can feel very proud. But at the same time, Wisconsin, they're going to go into the NCAA tournament, maybe on a loss, but they're playing good hockey.
You talk about Cole Caulfield, 28 goals now on the season, which incidentally is the same number of goals Blake Jeffreyon had when he won the Hobey with Wisconsin back in 2010. But there's a difference maker for Minnesota in these games, and it's a guy who's not going to be one of those Hobey finalists, but somebody who, when the game is on the line, has come through in this playoff series, and that's Sampo Ranta.
I've really liked Ranta from the beginning of the season, and I, because there is so much talent throughout that league and throughout some of the Western leagues, I think that his name gets lost every now and again. And I actually wouldn't be totally shocked to see him in the top 10 of the Hobey when it comes out tonight. But at the same time, as you say, maybe he gets overlooked because there is too much talent. But he was strong. I thought that, especially when you get into special team situations, he's big on that power play for Minnesota, and a natural goal scorer, a natural sniper. And, I guess there should be no surprise that we got into a 6-4 game last night when these two teams, I'm looking at Wisconsin with 115 goals in the year, Minnesota with 110 goals in the year. Nobody else in the Big Ten had more than 91. So these were two high-powered offenses, and a lot of goal scoring, a lot of talent up and down both of these rosters.
Yeah, we should also mention Sammy Walker. He was clutch. And then Jack LaFontaine, he had to make 46 saves on 50 shots against Wisconsin. I mean, that's just a ridiculous number. Roman Ashan was talking about how maybe the team was a little off and didn't quite have the hunger that they should have, but they still put up 50 shots on net.
I mean, 50 shots, that's a lot. You don't see goaltenders win the most outstanding player award too often when they give up 4 goals in the championship game. And that's exactly what happened here. You know, I think it was when you saw just the sheer numbers of what Jack LaFontaine had to actually produce in terms of saves last night. He had a tough night, and I thought it was kind of fitting to see Red Berenson hand him the MVP award. Red, of course, the special advisor to the commissioner in the Big Ten now, but he recruited Jack LaFontaine at Michigan 5-6 years ago, and then, of course, he transferred over to Minnesota and has had just a fantastic 2 years with the Gophers, and that's not over. And so it felt like something came full circle when you saw Red Berenson, you know, big handshake, big smile on Red's face to see this kid succeeding.
Well, let's take a look at the NCHC half of the ledger. Again, 1-goal games, St. Cloud State, 3-2 win over Minnesota Duluth. Those two teams have been so close and locked in such great battles this season. And then the other half of the semifinal, it took overtime for North Dakota to down Denver 2-1. In that game, what was really fascinating to me about it is Denver held a 1-0 lead until very late, had an opportunity maybe to make it 2-0 on an empty netter on an attempt that went wide. And right after that icing faceoff, North Dakota comes back to tie the game and then win it in overtime. That really sealed Denver's fortunes. Things could have been very different, but it did make the difference to allow North Dakota to go on to be the first team in the NCHC to win both the Penrose Cup and the conference tournament. That hasn't happened in the whole short, but starting to be legendary history of the league, and a 5-3 win last night over St. Cloud State. Again, a game that was very close and took an empty net goal very late to make it a 2-goal game. Terrific hockey out in Grand Forks as well.
It certainly was. And listen, North Dakota felt like a team of destiny, you know, to be trailing late, you know, in the semifinal, come back, win it in overtime. To be trailing again, don't forget that they were down both 1-0 and 2-1 in the third period. I know everything happened early in the third where they were able to tie it, take the lead, take a 2-goal lead, then have St. Cloud come back, you know, right after that and make it a 1-goal game. But, you know, I just felt like it felt like destiny for North Dakota. This you know, last 2 nights they played good hockey but still found themselves in holes. But that's a team that when the chips were down, they found a way to perform. And listen, it's not always easy. You mentioned the empty net goal that if Denver hits that, it's a 2-0 game. Forget it. You know, it's probably lights out. But instead, North Dakota comes back. I believe the tying goal goes off a shin pad, redirects, and goes in the net, and then you win one in overtime. And you know, you can let those however many fans were in the building, 3,000 or so, go nuts. And they had 2 nights of being able to do that. And so I congratulate Brad Berry. First NCHC title for North Dakota, which still strikes me. You know how strong that team has been throughout its existence in the NCHC. To have never won that tournament, it's kind of crazy. And that was what the tournament was. It was good hockey. It was crazy hockey. It was a frantic final period of hockey, and I guess the fans got every ounce of their money's worth.
One of the remarkable things about that third period, a few years ago, the rule was changed so that you still get the power play after a delayed penalty goal in college hockey. And that was the big turner there. The delayed penalty goal and then a power play goal right after it. A 2-2 game very quickly became 4-2. And that really changed the entire dynamic of the game. It rattled St. Cloud for a few minutes, although I think the Huskies kind of got things back together. But that was the big difference there.
It certainly was, you know, and everything had happened so quick because they had tied the game at 2, then a nice move and off a face-off player, if I remember right, and St. Cloud player takes the penalty and they allow the goal, and then right away on the power play they pop again. And, you know, I think it was 3 goals in 2 minutes and 22 seconds. That's usually a stunner. But St. Cloud held it together. They scored a shorthanded goal not too much later. And, we're in a 4-3 game. And I actually thought that, they had some good looks. Probably with 5 minutes left, they had a big opportunity in front that they just couldn't bury. And then they got off a good one-timer with the extra attacker from the left face-off circle. I believe, everything's kind of meshing together in my head, but I believe the goaltender had to make a save on that one. So they got their opportunities, but unfortunately that small amount of time, 2 minutes and 22 seconds where things got off the rails, that was really the difference in the game.
One of the things that struck me watching some of the games with the extra attacker, I'm starting to feel like you can tell almost immediately whether a team is going to score or not. Against Denver, I said, North Dakota's going to tie this thing up. It really felt like it. Last night,
it did.
It did not feel like Wisconsin was going to be able to do it. If a team cannot establish possession in the zone, they don't have a very good chance of getting that extra attacker goal at all. And you could see that right from the beginning, how teams defend it and whether they can even make a clean entry.
Well, that's interesting because I do believe that, obviously extra attacker is a special teams play, and what you have to do is find a way to get in the zone. It can be with speed and do so cleanly, handling the puck, and then you pull up and make sure that you get some sort of your offense set up, or it can be dump and chase. But if you can't successfully do either of those, you can't really gain the blue line with any speed or momentum. And when you're dumping it, you're not getting the retrieval and the other team's getting the puck out, even if they have to ice the puck. That usually is kind of the telltale sign that your extra attacker play wasn't working at the time. Most coaches will tell you what they really want on an extra attacker is an offensive zone faceoff, because then you get to put your best face-off man out there, hopefully win it. Then you're in a situation where you can move the puck. But, it's also, it's sometimes can be tough. You have to get that goal, and the most composed players are the ones you always have on the ice. But even the most composed players can lose their composure when they know that it's either put a puck in or the tournament's over for you.
Well, there's still 4 conferences to wrap up a title in their league. And we'll talk about what the NCAA picture looks like. Even without those decided, it's becoming pretty clear. We'll do that when Weekend Review continues.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from US College Hockey Online.
We're back with Weekend Review, the midweek edition for March 17th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Jim, we're pretty close in agreement on what we think the NCAA field looks like. I have an asterisk by one team that I would put at 95%. And then I have one team that I think maybe is a bubble team and not a lock. But otherwise, we're pretty much in agreement. So why don't we go through your list of teams? I'll comment on that, and then we'll talk about some scenarios.
Well, I'll start, and I've been saying this for weeks. AIC, even if they don't win the Atlantic Hockey Championship, I think should be in. If they are to lose, not win the championship, whether they lose in the semifinals or the finals, they'll either be 9 or 10 games over 500. And I'm sorry, if we're doing something wrong, we're doing a disservice if a team that has that strong of a record, is basically punished for the league that they play in. That's doesn't seem like something that makes sense to me.
And Jim, before we go on, I agree with you. I agree with you on that. However, I'm got the asterisk there. I'm putting them at about 95% because I think that if there are some upsets in league tournaments, there's going to be a battle about what caliber of play they had. Not that I agree with it, but I think there's some iffiness there, maybe in the committee, that I wouldn't agree with, but I think it's there. So that's why I'm calling them 95%. So I agree with you, except for that amount.
I don't disagree there. That's the whole thing, is that there's still a massive bias. And I've talked to a lot of coaches this week throughout the country about, teams in, teams out. And even in some of the bigger conferences, I was talking to one coach yesterday about Hockey East, and he said, why is nobody giving any respect to UConn? He said, because they were a game below 500. He said, you have Denver that's, 3 games below 500, and people are trying to already anoint them as national champions, saying that they should be in the field. But, it's not just UConn maybe not getting the respect to get in, but then our teams, getting respect for wins that they had against UConn? Is it a situation where you're maybe, giving, a Denver team credit for, win that they had over Omaha, but you might not be giving a Boston University or a Providence or a UMass credit for wins they had against UConn? Very similar situations. I know we'll get to that, but I feel like there's still a lot of biases. And if you haven't been in the tournament a lot over the last 10 years, there's a massive bias against you right now. But I'll move on and I'll go into the Big Ten. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, I think that they're all locks. The ECAC, I think Quinnipiac should be a lock. Could we see another team get in there? Potentially, St. Lawrence and Colgate will play tomorrow night, Thursday, and then the winner heads down to Hamden and faces Quinnipiac in a one-game winner-take-all championship. But I think if Quinnipiac does not win that game, they've still deserve to be in the tournament. I mean, they're 17-6-4. It's one of the better winning percentages in the country right now, and they've played. They've gone outside and actually tried to find some teams that were not ECAC clubs. So I'll stop right there, but I think that they should be in. In Hockey East, I see BC and UMass as definite locks. I think BU is probably there too. It didn't help them by losing to UMass Lowell in the quarterfinals, but single elimination, that's really difficult. I still think that they get in. You're talking about a 700 winning percentage. They only got in 15 games this year, but a 700 winning percentage is pretty good. So I'd put that against any team that's near the bubble. I think so. BU for me is in, especially because they beat good teams. They beat Massachusetts. They beat Boston College. They beat Providence. So I'll put those three as my ins for Hockey East. NCHC, North Dakota, St. Cloud State, Minnesota, Duluth, they're all in. Then you have Omaha and Denver on the bubble. We'll talk about that in a minute. Those two are just, befuddling to me in terms of what we do with them. And then the WCHA, Minnesota State, they're a lock. I know that you and I are kind of oscillating on this one. I think that Bemidji State has probably done enough to put them in. And then at the same time, I'm going to go against something I said a few weeks ago, team that I thought was probably in, and they just didn't perform well down the stretch, and they kind of knocked themselves out. That's Bowling Green. And when I really look at Bowling Green, they were 1-7 against the top three teams in their conference, Minnesota State, Lake Superior, and Bemidji State. And then when you look at the pairwise, Bowling Green has actually fallen below those three teams in the pairwise. So I know we don't use the pairwise overall, but conference-wise we do. So I think that I have now eliminated Bowling Green. I don't even have them as a bubble team anymore. 19-10-1 record's a good one, but just the way that this season went for them and down the stretch, there's too many teams in their own conference that are better than them.
Well, my list looks very much like yours. I don't have Bemidji as a lock yet. I have all the teams that you mentioned before Bemidji. Then my next band is the three teams who are most likely to be in, and those are Providence, Omaha, and then Bemidji. Now, if you take the list, your list and my list, and add those teams in, that still only gets you to 15. One of those could be a conference championship upset. And then I have 6 teams who I think are below that. I agree with you with Bowling Green. I have them in my list of 6 who are below that. They probably would be far down the list, especially because Lake Superior State and Northern Michigan are on that list and have moved ahead of them. If we rank the WCHA, I have Army on the list. That's a possibility. If Army ends up winning Atlantic Hockey, you could see it, Army and AIC in. A lot of folks have been making noise for Army. People are going to make the same argument about their schedule. They did play Long Island University 4 times, lost one of those games. Denver, we know the situation with Denver. They were coming very close. I think they are just too far down the list. If you put in 5 NCHC teams, they could be the 5th, but I think you're going to have a hard case to get them in there. And the other one I have on that list of 6 that are just below the 3 on the edge is Notre Dame. And I think you got to go a long way before you can get the Fighting Irish in there. So I think most likely you'd have Providence, Omaha, Bemidji, plus the 12 we mentioned. And then either a conference upset or a real argument over who one of the next teams would be out of maybe that list of 6.
Yeah. I do look at, Denver as just a team that we understand they were a talented team, but at the end of the day, you have to count wins as wins. And if you don't want to be judged by your record in a tough conference, don't play in a tough conference. Go back to the WCHA or whatever. Denver's in the league that they chose to be in, and there's a lot of talent in there. I understand that, but you can't just say, oh, well, they're 3 games below 500, but they're in a really tough conference. We should put them in. When you have really good teams, don't forget, we're going to leave out Bowling Green. I've already said that. But Bowling Green finished the season 9 games above 500. You've got potentially AIC could be in the same position. They could be 10 games above 500, not win their tournament. This is a team that's 3 games below 500. I get it. They played in a tough league, but that alone, being in a tough league, does not just automatically send you in. And don't forget, in any normal year, this wouldn't even be a conversation because they're far below 500 that we wouldn't even be allowed to consider them as at larges. But the rules this year were tweaked a little bit because of the pandemic that you could be below 500 and still be considered. I just, for me, it's one of those things. I just don't see a path for Denver, after they lost that semifinal game against North Dakota. You win that, I think that you've got to take credit for the wins you had against North Dakota this year. And that would have been yet another one, and that would have pumped you up a little bit. But when I really, really look at it, and it just goes back to their start. They had a tough start in the bubble, did not get off on the right foot. And then they never found a time in the year that they were just going to dominate. And that's what they needed. They didn't get there. And because of that, I've got to leave them out. I do say that I am heavily leaning toward Omaha being the 4th team from the NCHC and want to call them, outside of major upsets, I want to say that they're a lock because I do feel that they're really close. They lost a quarterfinal game. I get that. But listen, their record was excellent this year. They end up finishing 14-10-1, 4 games over 500. So I don't mind, putting Omaha in, but Denver just doesn't pass the smell test for me.
Well, I got a couple other points I want to touch on here. First of all, let's look at what would probably be the next 3 teams in. You had Bemidji on your list of locks, so I'm assuming you have Bemidji as the next team in. Bemidji, Providence, and Omaha, how do you rank those? Are you putting Bemidji ahead of those 2? And, who do you put next, Providence or Omaha? Well,
I would say that probably Providence. When you really think about it, they're the 4th best team, best record in Hockey East. They had 2 COVID pauses where they came back, or maybe it was 3 COVID pauses, but they were 0 for when they came off pauses. And I just, these pauses can be very difficult. There was a quirky transfer rule that their goaltender wasn't allowed to play in the first 2 games this year. And they lost those 2 games. So, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I think that, after I do put Bemidji ahead of them. I just think that Bemidji had the wins throughout the year. They had really good quality wins. Whereas Providence kind of stumbled at times in some of the bigger games. They took care of business in the teams that were below them in the standings for the most part. And then after that, probably Omaha. I guess that would be that would get me to 15, though. I think I'd still need 1 more. And at that point, I'm not sure. That is where if there's no upsets, if, teams like Lowell and Army and Canisius, Niagara, St. Lawrence, Colgate, Northern, they don't win championships this weekend, then you might have that 16th spot. Then do I go to Notre Dame, a game above 500 in a very tough Big Ten? Maybe. I still don't think I circle back to Denver. 3 games below 500, but I don't think I circle to Lake Superior. Am I missing anybody in here, Ed? I think that covered everybody.
Bowling Green and Army would be the other ones that might be considered. And, you've already talked about Bowling Green.
Army certainly deserves to be in if they win the tournament, but I still, they played in that weaker half of Atlantic hockey this year. a lot of their wins were able to come against some pretty rough teams. Obviously, you mentioned LIU. Sacred Heart did not have a strong year this year, although they took Army to triple overtime in the final game of the quarterfinal round. They played Bentley a bunch of times and took care of business against Bentley. They took care of business against Holy Cross. I mean, and I know it's only the schedule you can play. If they don't have some of their losses, or if they maybe just beat AIC once, they lost 3 in a row to AIC. I know that was early in the year, but that's the kind of the sticking point. Then losing one to LIU, those are the types of games in there that I just don't feel comfortable putting them in at large. Win the tournament, you're in, that's great. And I think that then you throw AIC in there with them. But I just don't feel comfortable putting Army in there at large. And that's no disrespect to their program or that league. It just didn't, they just didn't win the games that they had to. And that's those 3 against AIC. Just win one of them and I'd feel better about it. Losing all 3 hurts.
Well, I think we both agree that barring a bunch of upsets that would take the space away, you're going to see 4 teams from the NCHC, with the last one of those 4 being Omaha. That's if there are no upsets among the 4 tournaments left to go. But I want to ask you if you think there's a possibility of 5 teams from Hockey East. And the only way that I would see that happening is if UMass Lowell wins the league and gets in with the auto bid. Do you have room for BC, UMass, BU, and then Providence for 5 teams out of Hockey East?
I guess I have to say there's a big if in there. And it's if there's no other upsets in the country, then maybe. But if Lowell wins the tournament and then you potentially want to try to put Providence in that last spot, if they fit, yes. But I wouldn't want to leave, I would say, Bemidji State to put Providence in and give Hockey East 5 and maybe leave the WCHA with 1. And the same goes for Atlantic Hockey. If AIC doesn't win and Army does, I don't think I want to put Providence in just to get them in the field. I think that 4 is a very fair number for conferences this year. Not to say that you can't get that 5th in, but 4 is a fair number. And I think if you start trying to, really find ways to put a 5th team in from Hockey East, it really it throws things off.
You could very well see a 10-6 split Western Leagues to Eastern Leagues. If you get 4 from Hockey East, 1 from Atlantic, and 1 from ECAC, it could be 10-6. And folks are asking me, is that going to happen? Is that right? And here's why it's right. Closing down the Ivy Leagues this year took at least 2 teams who would be in the mix out of that. And, think Harvard and Cornell. We probably would be talking about them right now had they had a season. Maybe somebody else from the Ivies, maybe Union, maybe Rensselaer, both teams that were on Union had a tough season last year, but Rensselaer has been steadily improving. If you had the Ivies playing this year, you'd probably be looking at an 8-8 split, and you might not be talking about 3 teams or 4 teams from some leagues. So I think a 10-6 or 9-7 split is very likely and would be justified. Now, based on some of the reporting I've seen from decisions made in the women's committee, and they're completely separate committees, so there's probably a small amount that you can transfer from one to the other, but they said that regions did not come into play. They were not looking at regional balance for that. They were looking at what teams should be in, which one shouldn't. There was a huge amount of controversy there when Minnesota was left out. I don't think we're going to see as much controversy with the men, particularly because most of this is locked up. 1 or 2 teams may end up being controversial at the end, but I don't think we're going to see anybody left out who should be in. There's enough of a divider there to make that difference. But I would suggest that the men's tournament will also take the same approach and not be hung up on regional balance, again, because you lost those 6 teams in the Ivies with 2 or 3 national contenders in that mix.
Yeah, the one thing I will say about that and the big difference between the men's tournament and the women's tournament is that the women's was played all in one location, so everybody was traveling to the same place. I do wonder if the committee gets into a situation where they have to go 6-10 or 7-9, and thus can keep Western teams West, Eastern teams East, just move one Western team. Maybe they would lean toward getting a 7-9, 7 Eastern teams, 9 Western teams. I don't think there's a way to get to 8-8. There really isn't, unless you have you really don't have it. I think that if you had upsets in both Atlantic Hockey and the ECAC, then I think that might compromise one of the Hockey East teams. If you had upsets in all 3 of them, maybe that's the only way we ever get to 8-8. But I know that there's a desire. We talked to Mike Kemp, and he said that they would like to keep, as little travel. But the reality is look at where the regionals are. I guess in the East, you can make most of these. If you're an Eastern team, you can make Albany kind of an easy bus ride. But out west, Loveland, Colorado is in the middle of kind of nowhere compared to the rest of the teams that are going to be in the tournament. So 4 teams are going to be hopping on charter planes no matter what. If you're going to be hopping on a charter to Loveland, will you put a team on a charter to Bridgeport or Albany? Absolutely. So I don't think that the number of teams just trying to, slow down the amount of travel or reduce the amount of travel will really impact it. So I think I kind of agree that it'll take the same approach as women's. There is the caveat of the regionals as opposed to one site, but I still think when push comes to shove, they're just going to try to get the 16 best teams.
I thought that was going to be our last point, but I've got one more. I think right now the leading teams to be number 1 seeds in regionals would be Minnesota, Boston College, North Dakota, Minnesota State. You send BC to Bridgeport, probably. North Dakota is going to be in Fargo because they're the host school. Then either Minnesota or Minnesota State has to go either to Loveland or to Albany, in my thinking. But do you see those as the top 4? And, is that the dilemma they have on travel?
I think so. I think that's one of them. There's probably going to be another team probably down in the 4th band. Maybe it's Omaha that might have to switch as well and do some extra traveling. I think that the team that probably would end up out east in the scenario you just gave me is probably Minnesota State. And listen, for them, I feel like it's becoming old hat. They were, in Providence 2 years ago because you had 3 Western teams that were number 1 seeds. So I feel like, Minnesota, has to stay somewhere west, and you probably send them to Loveland. But it's one of those things that if you had a conference matchup, that you were trying to avoid, where the number 4 seed is in the same conference as one of those, you maybe switch it, and that would be the only way I would see get the Gophers traveling as far east as maybe Albany. So I think that they're probably going to be in Loveland. You'll probably see North Dakota. Well, you will see North Dakota in Fargo. They're undoubtedly a number 1 seed, possibly the number 1 team overall when all is said and done. But I see Minnesota State as probably the most likely. Now, if they lose in their tournament, and maybe say UMass wins the Hockey East tournament, could that put UMass up into a number 1 seed? I think so. And that would be the way that it would level off. But for the most part, I really do see 3 number 1 seeds coming from the West and one of them ending up out in the Albany Regional.
Well, it's going to be fun over the next few days. We'll take a look at the weekend's games on tomorrow's Game of the Week podcast. But for right now, for Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review Podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.